publishing is an exercise in possibility. And that's how I look at it. I really want it. I want our books to be, I want to create possibilities for artists, both creative and economic. I want to create things that maybe wouldn't exist if we didn't exist.
Hello and welcome back to the Ryan Claytor Patreon podcast. I've got a great one for you today. I just wrapped up a conversation with Josh O'Neill, co-founder of Beehive Books. If you're not familiar with Beehive Books, they put out a number of fantastic publications with a really high attention to production detail. And I chat with him not only about Beehive, but also his most current Kickstarter campaign for another book in their series of Illuminated Editions, where they pair classic texts with current illustrators and just go above and beyond in terms of production design for each book. The current running Kickstarter is for Carmilla, and let's get into the conversation with Josh O'Neill. I want to hear a little bit about Carmilla and this project from you first, Josh, before I get into some questions that I've got for you. So can you regale us with how this project came to be, how you got paired up with Rosemary Valero-O'Connell, who is just, if you haven't seen the Kickstarter campaign yet, please go look at her illustrations. They are just out of this world. So enough from me. Let's hear about you, Josh, and Carmilla. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you having me. It's always good to talk to you. So I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, I am so excited about the Carmilla project. It really is something just so beautiful. So I'll give people a little context for what it is. It's part of this ongoing series we have. It's an imprint called Illuminated Editions, in which we take classic fiction, sometimes poetry or theater, and we commission new artwork for them from contemporary illustrators, often cartoonists, various kinds of artists. And so we've done books from Crime and Punishment and The Great Gatsby and The Island of Dr. Moreau to somewhat more obscure titles like The Willows and The Blazing World. And we've worked with all kinds of artists from, Dave McKean and Bill Sienkiewicz and Brecht Evans and tons and tons of wonderful people. We've started this in 2017. We've done 11 titles so far. Carmilla will be our 12th title. And it's
in the Illuminated series, right? And
yes,
more beyond that.
Yeah. Beehive is a larger project, and Illuminated Editions is like an imprint within Beehive. And we do about 2 or 3 a year in this imprint. And yeah, this is going to be the 12th one. And we've always wanted to work with Rosemary, whose work is just so beautiful, and she has such vision and such style. And I really can't imagine a better text to pair her with than Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a book which I really should be much better known than it is. It's such an important and influential book. It's really the first famous vampire novel. For one thing, it was a huge influence on Bram Stoker and Dracula. So it kind of created the concept of vampires in pop culture and in literary fiction. And it's also one of the first mainstream depictions of a queer romance. It's a sort of dark, tormented love story between these two young women. And it has this sort of fascinating and complicated history because it was written by a straight man, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who was a great Irish writer of the time. And it's from the 1860s. And so it's not exactly in terms of the actual text, it's not really pro-queer or pro-gay, because one of the characters in this lesbian romance is a vampire. And so in some ways it equates lesbianism with vampirism. But underneath that, it has this deep romantic yearning between these two women, which is very intensely moving and beautiful. So it has all these different political currents inside of it. in some ways, there are pieces of it that are almost homophobic, or not almost, that are homophobic. There are pieces of it that are tender and loving and romantic. And it was really taken up over generations as like an early piece of queer literature that meant a lot to a lot of gay people in the late 19th, early 20th century and beyond. Um, so Rosemary has really taken her own approach to how to look at this story, um, and how to sort of elaborate, how to work with it and work against it in different ways. And that's always my favorite thing with the Illuminated Editions series, when I'm not so interested in illustrating a text that already exists and depicting the scenes that take place in a book. I love it when one of our illustrators really has a conceptual approach to, they want to do something different than what the author is doing, and they work with each other, they work against each other, and between them they create this third thing that is created when the reader encounters these the art and the text alongside each other in these beautiful editions that we put together. So that's always what gets me most excited about Illuminated Editions, and Rosemary has done that in such a beautiful and unique way. And we have an introduction from Poppy Z. Bright, who is one of my favorite authors. And so I'm just really, really excited about this book, and I can't wait to get it in front of people.
You should be. You were kind enough to let me take a look at an advanced PDF copy, and I was really wowed by all the design work, all the illustration work. And you said something that was in my mind as I was reading through the book, that it's hard to imagine a more perfect pairing of Carmilla and Rosemary Valero-O'Connell. It just seems like this work belongs together. And I've also heard you say what you mentioned in this interview, in other interviews, that you're interested in the illustrations for Illuminated Editions as being more than just depicting the scenes that exist, but thinking about the work more conceptually. What are the conceptual ideas behind it? And how can those illustrations be a little left of center and illuminate it in a different way? So can you speak a little bit about how that's worked with Carmilla and Rosemary Valero-O'Connell's illustrations, and then maybe also an example or two from past Illuminated editions that you think where this happened particularly well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of the magic of prose fiction is the fact that images are created in the mind of the reader. So I think it's actually very easy. I love illustrated fiction. I have a deep love of illustrated fiction. I collect a lot of golden age of illustration, illustrated books from the 19th century and various. I think it's just such an interesting medium of storytelling. But it's very easy for it to be a a, a value subtraction, because part of the joy of reading a book is that you sort of generate the world of the book inside your own head based on the words in the text. And so there's sort of a collaborative thing that's happening between an author and a reader. And every reader has their own version of a book that they imagine. You sort of have to meet the author halfway, because the images aren't there, the sounds aren't there, the feelings aren't there, only words are there. Um, so I think if you illustrate a book and what you do is draw beautiful images of the characters and the scenes as depicted by the author, you're sort of doing the reader's work for them in a way that makes the book kind of less interesting, even if the illustrations may, as pieces of art, be incredibly beautiful and may stand alone as something wonderful. They don't really work as illustrated fiction to me. So I'm always much more interested in when people want to try something that I mean, that sort of illuminates parts of the text that they want to point the reader to. That I love it when you get a chance to see the text through the creativity and the imagination of an author. They're not showing you what it looks like; they're showing you what it feels like for them as a reader. Um, and I think what Rosemary has done that's so beautiful is sort of play along these lines of what Le Fanu was doing with the character of Carmilla, who's a very enigmatic character, who is menacing in some ways, who is vulnerable in some ways. You don't get a lot of interiority from Carmilla. You get a lot from Laura, who's the protagonist of the novel, who enters into this relationship with Carmilla. But Carmilla, you never quite understand her as a character from the inside. Um, and so I think Rosemary has given us some of that, some of the mystery of Carmilla, and some of the vulnerability and some insight into a version of who she is, but left enough mystery there for the reader to wonder about it. And I think it's just really special and a really unique vision of this wonderful book. And we have so many other examples. My favorite from one of our past books might be, or the most like radically conceptual, at least from one of our past books, was when Brecht Evans illustrated Peter Pan for us. He literally did not depict anything that's ever described in the text. Peter Pan does not appear in his illustrations. None of the characters, Captain Hook does not appear. Um, he just took the concept of Neverland and illustrated other things from his own imaginary vision of Neverland, which is so fitting with Peter Pan as a text, because Peter Pan has this wonderful sort of play along the fourth wall where the narrator is always talking directly to the reader and often gesturing towards things that are never explained. The narrator will say, well, I could tell you about the time that Peter baked himself into a cake, but we don't have any time for that, so I'm not going to tell you about that. So he'll gesture sort of to things that he does not dig into at all, or there'll be a quick reference to something. And so Brecht really took that and ran with it and created, this slipcase that he designed is this gorgeous sort of three-dimensional map of Neverland, like a relief map of Neverland. And then the illustrations have they're almost an atlas of creatures and places, and they sort of create this whole third story layer of children playing and imagining things. There's a lot of his illustrations are also full of things that are being transformed by imagination. They're part of a child with a sheet over their head and part of a crocodile, and yeah, so that's really what I love, and that's always, from an editorial standpoint, it's something we always try to talk to our artists about, and it's very important to us when we choose artists to pick people who really have narrative sensibility and to have a sort of conceptual approach to how they think about things, because we want to generate these really new versions of these stories, not just illustrated versions of the stories. So Rosemary has just done that so beautifully and so thoughtfully and so creatively. And I just could look at her illustrations for forever. And she really built a world within this story. And
even down to the drop caps. I mean, those are some of the most gorgeous drop caps I've ever seen in a book or any publication for that
they're
matter.
so beautiful, aren't they?
Oh my
And I should
gosh.
also credit our amazing designer, Ali Oldfeld,
Ah,
did really incredible work on those drop caps and the chapter headers and the repurposed spot illustrations and a million clever, brilliant little things. The ways she used Rosemary's illustration are really a part of what make this so special. My partner Mael, who is the creative director of Beehive and co-founder, her design sensibility really created the Illuminated Editions series, and she designed the first 10 books in this series. She's been on sabbatical for the past year, and so the last two are our first two with new designers. And Ali has just picked up the baton from Mael, who has such a special vision for what this series is, and she brought her own thing to it while also really speaking in the voice of this continuing series.
yeah,
And
I was going to ask you about Ali because I noticed that some of the drop caps had elements from existing illustrations elsewhere in the story. It took me a minute to figure that out because it's so beautifully illustrated and there's so many illustrations in here. But I started to notice some similarities and thought, well, it must have been Rosemary who's illustrating digitally in layers and can peel this thing apart, but it sounds like maybe Allie was the one to
That
like
was Allie.
silhouette
Yeah,
these
that was
things.
Allie
And
pulling out, like taking spot illustrations that Rosemary did,
mm,
or pulling pieces out of her full page illustrations.
wow.
And I mean, she really went all in. It took a lot of like logistical work even just to make it work. Some of it she had to redraw some things even, and she really worked very hard on this book and gave everything to making it the most sort of immersive and enveloping piece of design and storytelling that she possibly could. And
From a creative
yeah, she's
standpoint, I
amazing.
can
She's doing a lot more stuff for us recently, and she's really become a big part of what we do. She's only been working with Beehive for the past year or year and a half, but she's very quickly become a huge collaborator for us.
That's incredible. Yeah, I was looking at those from a creative standpoint and wondering about the logistics behind them. And to know that it was a second creative person who is bringing that to fruition is pretty amazing. There's a ton of work, as you said, even like redrawing elements to make them work. That's why I was thinking it must have been Rosemary who did this, because who else is going to have the time and inclination and artistic sensibility to make all that happen? Anyway, all that to say, the book is gorgeous. And before we started the interview, you and I were talking about how we're both very interested in over-the-top production value when it comes to books. And with that said, I wanted to ask you about Carmilla specifically, since it's running right now. What are some of the amazing finishes and flourishes that you have planned for this book?
Well, I mean, so we have for the Illuminated Edition series, each book is always housed in a slipcase that has a sort of die cut, uh, embossed and debossed cover. So it has this like wraparound image on the slipcase that almost has like a sculptural, textural quality, usually printed in foil or silk screened. Um, and then the covers themselves have no typography at all on them. They don't even have the title on the cover. They only have the title on the spine. And so they have a very unusual quality. You sort of don't know what you're looking at when you look at one of these books because the slipcase doesn't have any type on it. The cover doesn't have any type on it. They all have wraparound illustration everywhere. Um, and then we also do these really special high-end editions. We have our standard edition, then we have a signed and numbered edition that's limited to 250 copies. It's signed by Rosemary. Um, and the slipcase is bound in cloth, and the book has foiled page edges, which are just like so gorgeous. They have a silk ribbon. They have all these special features. And then we do a hyper limited edition. It's a lettered edition. We only produce 26 of them. They're lettered A to Z. They come with an original drawing from Rosemary. Um, and they come in these huge Solander cases, like a clamshell with these French doors that open. You can see images if you go on our website. It's sort of hard to explain, but they're absolutely gorgeous. They have these laser cut metal plates that are mounted on the front of them, and these sort of doors open up, and then the slipcase book is inside this gorgeous Solander. And those are very expensive. They cost $1,500. They're incredibly rare. And those have been something we've been doing for our last handful of titles, and they've been really fun to work with because when you're doing so few of them, you can really spend a lot of money on each one. And so you can sort of say like, let's just go all out. Let's not cut any corners. Let's see what we can do if we're gonna spend, $200 a copy just to print it. And so that's been a really, really fun and interesting thing. So we just try to make every book we do, whether it's a high-end expensive edition or not, we really think about the three-dimensionality, the physicality, the paper stock, the printing, the binding. Like we really think through what this is as an object. Um, and that's, I think, a big hallmark of Beehive and a big hallmark of this Illuminated Edition series is like we care so much about tactility, about the physical reading experience, and about the format, about the size, about every material that we use. We really try to get it just right. And we drive ourselves a little bit insane, proofing and reproofing and testing and retesting, but it's worth it. We're just all very obsessive about this stuff, and
Yeah,
we
it's
just get excited about it in our own offices.
it's apparent from the outside, and as someone who feels very similarly about creating books, it's why I wanted to have you on here and have this conversation. And I'm
Your
curious.
design sensibility is also amazing and
Oh,
beautiful and very, very much fits, I think, with our aesthetic. I think we're cousins.
thank you. That means a lot, especially coming from somebody who's produced so many beautiful books. So thank you. But steering things back to you, I'm also curious about the process of organizing one of your illuminated editions like Carmilla. I know in the past you've cited Pinocchio with Magnola on art duties as taking like 2.5 years to prepare. So I'd love to hear if that's like a typical turnaround time for something like this, or if the timelines expand and contract based on the creatives that are involved. What does that typically look like for you organizing an illuminated edition?
They expand and contract for sure. Each one is a little bit different, just depending on the artist that we're working with, how much illustration they're doing. I mean, it can vary from probably a year to 3 years, I would say. Um, but generally, we try to give our artists about a year to do the portfolio, which not all artists want or need. I mean, a lot of artists would rather, I have a window for it in these 3 months, and this is when I want to get it done, which is great for us. But we usually say like, here's a year if you can fit it in sometime during that year. And then the design process probably takes about another 6 months or so. Um, and then proofing can be pretty time consuming. Pinocchio took longer, not because Mike Mignola took longer. He actually finished his illustration portfolio pretty quickly because he did that in like the early days of COVID lockdowns.
Mhm.
So it was just a time when nobody was leaving the house. So he just was like, this will be a great distraction from the misery that's going on everywhere in the world, and I'll just totally immerse in this. Um, we had a lot of production challenges with it since Mike uses so much black in his artwork. We really wanted to make the blacks look even sharper and starker than they often do in our books because we love uncoated paper. We generally don't like coated paper. Though we do use coated paper sometimes because some certain things reproduce better on them, including blacks
Mhm.
and certain very saturated colors. Um, so we spent a long time trying different production processes, doing long like proofing back and forth with our printer, trying to get the blacks to look right. That probably ate up 6 months of the project,
Mm.
just the blacks. And then we also had we tried something really different with Pinocchio, which is we had this third story layer from Lemony Snicket, where we often will have a great author write an introduction or some kind of essay for the book. We've had them from Guillermo del Toro and Alan Moore and Michael Cunningham and Darren Aronofsky, a lot of really great writers we've been very lucky to work with. But Lemony Snicket, when we invited him to write an introduction, said, what if I write a full annotation of the text in character as Lemony Snicket, with the idea being that Lemony Snicket is slowly driven mad by Pinocchio. Like over the course of this story, he loses his mind because of just the general like lunacy that is the text of Pinocchio.
Yeah.
Um, so we loved that idea.
Mhm.
And then we had this concept, well, what if we presented them on these little type sheets as though Lemony Snicket was like typing these notes in his study and then jamming them each in one for each chapter of the book. Uh, so that also ate up a lot of time on the design end and then on the production end, getting them just right so they really feel like these handmade little type sheets that are slipped in. Um, so that was part of what extended the timeline of that one too.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
love.
generally, I think an average is probably 18 months to 2 years. It takes us to do one of these, and then we'll do a Kickstarter usually or crowdfunding campaign towards the end of the process, and then we'll print it, and that takes another 4 months or so. Um,
Yeah, I love that idea from Snicket. I've heard you talk about it in prior interviews, and I've since seen unboxing videos of Pinocchio, and I'm not sure if buyers were aware of what was happening, or maybe they didn't read the campaign closely enough, but they'll look through it and they're like, what's this? I guess I'll read
Yeah.
that later. And just to see their
I love
general
for a
bafflement
book.
about that.
Yes, that's exactly what we were trying to create. Because
Yeah.
for one thing we really wanted to do, all three of us, Snicket and Mignola and us at Beehive, we really wanted to point people towards the original story of Pinocchio, which has been so replaced in the public imagination by all the adaptations, by the Disney version, which, I love the Disney movie and many of the adaptations are amazing. Uh, but that original story is so bizarre and
Yeah.
so much weirder than
Yeah.
any of the adaptations.
Mhm.
Uh,
Which are
so we
already
really
pretty
wanted to
weird.
highlight darkness and weirdness and violence and chaos and fun of the original text. And so I think that's a lot of what Snicket was pointing to. And I love the idea that you open this book and a million pieces of paper come fluttering out. And you're like, already you're lost, and
Yeah.
it's a chaotic experience before you even start reading it.
Yeah.
So
Contributing to
I
that
love that. I
madness.
love the idea that these are surprising people.
Totally. Yeah. So if you're working on an illuminated edition for a couple years, plus or minus, and coming out with them, 2 or 3 times a year, how many do you have in the works at any given time? Like right now, for example, like if you're able to pull yourself away from the Carmilla launch, uh, how many illuminated editions are in progress right now?
Lot, honestly. I mean, we're trying. Yeah, our goal with Beehive has been to speed up. We're very slow and we don't publish that many books. And I really would love that we have so many projects that we would just love to do, and they take us forever to get to. People pitch us books and we often have to turn them down, even though we love them because we don't have time for them. Or if we do agree to do them, we end up in a situation where the author's waiting for 3.5 years while we get our shit together to do it. Um, so I really want to do these faster. Um, so we have a lot in the works right now, and I hope we can keep up with these great artists that we have, because I think we have, I mean, there's a different question between how many we have planned and how many are actively being worked on right now. Because we have some that we have agreements with artists to do them, but the artist has not begun working on them yet. They're going to do them next year. But I think we have the next seven
Hmm.
all decided on, at least.
Wow. Interesting.
And they're not all fully contracted, and several of them the artists have not even begun working on. So it's possible a couple of those may get changed or canceled, or the artist will have a different idea for a different text they want to do. But in my mind, I do have the sequence of what the next seven of these are. And maybe even there's a couple that I don't think I've committed to yet, but would love to do and have been talking to people about. There's two or three more. So in my mind, I maybe have almost 10. But at the rate we go, that'll take us through another 4 years. And I would love to be able, I want to be able to do four of these a year, five of these a year. That would be so
Wow.
great. Um, and yeah, we're just slow. And I think that's part of being as obsessive as we are. We really care about every aspect of these projects, and caring just takes time. But we're trying to bring more people on who can manage some of the production, and we're working on various things, but we have some really, really exciting ones coming up.
Well, speaking of your rate of production, in another interview you conducted, this was maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, you talked about how Beehive Books was originally just you and Mael, but
Mhm.
that recently at that time you started hiring some folks to keep up with all the logistics associated with running multiple Kickstarter campaigns and distributing books and managing creative work. And I thought I'd check in with you to sort of see what the state of Beehive Books looks like today as we're approaching 2025. So is it still just you and Mael? Do you have full-time staff at this point? Like, what does
So
that look like
we have
now?
a
And
bunch of great people now. We don't have any full-time staff. Everyone working at Beehive, except for me, is part-time. And Mael is actually on sabbatical right now. So currently I'm like the only person working here full-time. But we've got a lot of great people. We probably have I don't know, people kind of come and go a bit, but maybe eight or 9 people right now who are working on our books, and we're very lucky. I mean, we also have like great freelance designers, people like Allie, who is not like an employee of Beehive. She just does individual projects for us, but she's been very, she's working hard on a lot of Beehive stuff. Um, we've got a great cartoonist named Kit Anderson, who is in her own right an amazing artist who lives in Switzerland, and she's been doing a lot of production and editorial work for us, and she is just an absolute treasure. We've got someone in Philly whose name is Elaine Maulucci, who's been doing a lot of marketing and logistics stuff for us, and she also is just wonderful. John Haroon, who he may actually work more hours for Beehive than anybody, and he's just on fulfillment and distribution stuff, and he's the one who's in the office with me most days. Because he's in charge of our whole shipping operation at this point, and he's fantastic. And I'm forgetting a bunch more people because we have lots of great people. But we're lucky. We found some really wonderful people to help with the books. But everybody's part-time, so it's always a challenge, like gluing everyone's schedule together and making sure people have time for meetings and can communicate with each other. That's a big part of the challenge of Beehive, is figuring out our systems so they are coherent and not when it was just me and Mael, it was chaos. And we are both so passionate, and so we just care so much about the books. Like, we would make it work. Like, we would always make everything work. Um, but we didn't really have good, like, repeatable systems. We were just throwing things at the wall and just going, oh God, okay, deal with this disaster and then deal with that disaster and then fix this problem, fix that problem. Um, but we have in the last few years taken a lot of steps towards kind of figuring out a process that is repeatable and makes sense and is not exhausting and stressful and chaotic and confusing, and that we can bring other people into. Um, because it's different when it's just you and your partner, and you can treat yourself like a horrible boss, and you don't feel ethically conflicted about it because you're like, it's
Right.
just me, I'm allowed to abuse myself. But then when you have other people, you're like, this has to be a livable situation. Like, it
Yeah.
can't be just like, there's an emergency happening, like, you deal with this right now every 2 days. Like, so that's a big, we've started to try to look at Beehive itself as an institution the way we look at one of our books. Like, we won't accept a book that is messy and chaotic and unpredictable, and maybe in the content, but not in like the production. And so that's where we're trying to look at Beehive itself as we would treat one of our projects, care about all the little pieces of it and try to make them make sense and work together.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure that's a challenge in and of itself. So, with all these new folks now involved with Beehive, how has your role changed? What are you doing in a typical week at Beehive?
I mean, there's no typical week because there's so many. Any small press, I feel like, is probably the same. There's just so many things to do, and there's not enough people or hours to do them.
Yeah.
So everybody at probably any small press with any level of ambition that's trying to put out a bunch of good material is going to be wearing so many hats. And our most of our employees, I mean, John being the exception, because like shipping is a pretty, not a full, he doesn't work full time, but that in and of itself is a pretty all-enveloping thing. Um, but people like Elaine and Kit also are doing 40 different things. Even though they might only be working 10 hours a week, they might be doing marketing stuff and production stuff and editorial stuff and logistical stuff, and it's just like whatever is the thing that floats up that day, whether it's working directly on the books, whether it's working on more general Beehive promotional stuff, whether it's getting ready for a festival that we're going to. Um, there's just a million little pieces. So I don't really have like a coherent approach to a work day. I just have like a really I have very bad attention deficit disorder. So I need everything to be like externalized. So I just have really complicated like to-do list systems,
Mm.
basically. And I just, I wake up in the morning and I get in front of the computer and I just start trying to knock things off these lists and see what the emergencies are. But I think how my role has changed is that it's a lot more managerial than it used to be, which does not come naturally to me at all. I think I'm a good editor, and I'm good at talking through the creative sides of things with people, and I'm good at putting creative people in positions to do their best work. But in terms of logistics and schedules and workloads and like I don't have a gift for any of that stuff.
Mhm.
But it's interesting and that's something I've had to learn along the way because we're never going to be able to get faster and get bigger um, if I'm not able to do that stuff. So that's been a fascinating challenge, and I think it's something I'm slowly getting better at, and I'm learning from the people that we work with, because I try to always check in with everybody about how things are going and how they feel about the work that they're doing, and if there's work often when we hire people, they end up in totally different roles
Mm.
than we hire them for because you just learn about you get to know each other, they get to know the work, we get to know them, and you realize, okay, maybe they might be good at XYZ, but maybe they just don't enjoy it. And they're also good at ABC, and that's work that's more exciting. And so it's a very interesting process. And part of the fun of it is we get to work with such lovely people, and you really get to know them, and they're in the trenches with you. And it's a very bonding experience, small
Yeah.
press publishing, because it's you against the world.
So, with your increased managerial duties, does that mean a decrease in editorial duties? Do you find it hard to make time and make room for that with all this other managerial stuff that you have to do now?
Well, that's actually one of the hardest things for me because that's the work I love, and I don't want to outsource the work I love to somebody else and just keep the work that I find a little bit draining.
Yeah.
So that's a work in progress. I mean,
Mm.
I I try to just make room for everything, but it's also, the editorial work is really the fun stuff in a lot of ways, the editorial and design. Um, and so a lot of the people that we work with also are great editors, and that's the work they love too. I mean, like, uh, so that's in some ways the easiest work to outsource because we have great people who
Mm.
are eager to do that work.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, that really it's just it kind of depends on the week and on the project. And I am sometimes a little greedy with some of that work where I'm just like, I want to do it. It's fun to think through some of these things.
I mean, that's
Um,
why you started Beehive in the first place,
yeah,
right?
and it's the part that I feel like I'm best at.
Uh-huh.
So I want to be able to bring that value to what we do. But yeah, I'm very unresolved about a lot of that. But I mean, as we are growing and we're getting bigger and we're doing more stuff, so um, I can outsource more of that to some of these other wonderful people that we work with. And there's no end to the editorial work and the challenging creative work that we have. So yeah, I don't want to do less of it, really. That's something that I know I don't want. But I do have to do more of a lot of other managerial stuff. So something's got to give, and I'm sort of figuring it out as I go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wish you luck finding that balance.
Thank you.
In the meantime, I've heard you say that even though your Illuminated editions have primarily focused on reprinting the classics, that future projects might have an eye toward more contemporary works, and I'm curious what that might look like.
Well, I mean, we're sort of open to anything that feels like it fits with this series. I mean, we're working on a project with Julie Doucet right now,
Hmm.
uh, who is about to illustrate a series of short stories by women. They're all by different authors, and most of them are from the early 20th or 19th century. Um, but we have a couple of more contemporary ones, like we have a Shirley Jackson story from the 50s in there. And so that's probably the most contemporary thing uh, we will have done with this series. But and we don't have any we don't have any projects in the pipeline that are more contemporary pieces. They're all still sort of classics or, lesser known books from the past that should be classics. Um, but we're sort of open to it. It's just a matter of what feels right within the series, and it usually starts with our artists, which I think is something that makes this that makes our illustrated books a little bit unusual. Is that we're doing something a little bit similar to a company like Folio Society that's wonderful and does beautiful illustrated editions of books. Um, but I think one of the things that makes us a little different from them is how art forward we are. For Folio Society, it's really the text, and then they get wonderful illustrators to do gorgeous portfolios of illustration for that text. But for us, it's like we actually think about the artist before we think about the text. Usually, we think about who the artist we want to work with is. We make contact with them and say, we explain what the series is and say we would love to work with you on a book in this series. And then there's some kind of dialogue about what that book might be. There have been exceptions to that. There have been times when we asked artists to specifically, we had an idea, we think you would be great to illustrate X. But in general, it starts with us just reaching out to an artist and saying, we would love to work with you. What's your favorite book? Do you have like any books that you've always like had a dream of illustrating? Any books you have an interesting vision of that you think you could do something cool with? Um, so that's sort of um, part of how we put together the whole concept of this series is that we think you get and maybe the whole concept of our company is that we think you get the best work out of artists when they're working on things they're the most excited by and that they're the most passionate about. Um, so I think if we were talking to an artist and they had an idea for something that we thought we could get a license for and that we think would really fit within the boundaries of the rest of the series, we're totally open to it. So we're just sort of feeling our way through.
Interesting. So I also want to touch on some business type stuff too, because I know there's a lot of creative and business synergy within Beehive and also within being an entrepreneurial artist. So I know you've conducted a bunch of Kickstarter campaigns at this point. I think it's over 24 now, if
Yeah, it
I'm
sounds
my
about right.
my count is correct. Okay. Um, but I also, so it looks like you know what you're doing from the outside. But I also know from experience that there must have been some mistakes along the way. So I was hoping that maybe you could
So many
share
mistakes.
uh, a couple of lessons learned, maybe like an introductory lesson and maybe a more advanced lesson for folks who are closer in a position of Beehive right now. So what are some things that you've learned from doing this Kickstarter business model?
Oh my God. So many things. We've made so many mistakes. That's the only way you learn stuff, really, in my experience. Uh, But yeah, I mean, our whole company is based on a crowdfunded model. We would not exist in the form that we do if it was not for some kind of crowdfunding, because we are a totally independent company. We have no outside investment. We're totally reader supported. And we do these books that are often, we do things across the spectrum of cost, but often they're kind of high end. They're beautiful productions. They have elaborate materials. They're often really large formats. They're very expensive to produce. So we had no money going into this, and we would never have been able to fund a project like this. We would have had to, take out, $50,000 of loans, and then who knows if the book is going to sell, and your company's over if the book doesn't sell.
Mhm.
We've been lucky. We've been able to go to readers and say, here's our vision of what we want to do. And people have been willing to support us, and you get the funds before you print the book. And you're not in a position where you might have some catastrophic financial failure, because the worst that happens is you lost a little bit of money and a lot of time. Um, So that's been our whole model from the beginning. And crowdfunding is amazing for that reason. And I love how community oriented it is. But there's a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of downsides to crowdfunding also. And we've made so many mistakes in terms of just not budgeting things out properly, not predict, like, so many costs that have popped up that we did not predict going into projects, not looking at shipping. Shipping costs are really a big budgeting challenge because you just don't know what they're going to be. Because you could, for all you know, half the people who buy the book are going to be in China. And, then your shipping cost is going to be maybe 50% of the cost of the whole project. Or maybe everyone that lives in Philadelphia, and then your shipping cost is going to be very low. So trying to like always build in enough buffer for the things that you didn't predict. Also, like timelines, we've really screwed ourselves up on timelines before. One thing we've learned is never build something around an ideal timeline. Never go, oh, well, if the proof comes in on this date and then we approve the proof on that date, and then the final samples come in on this date, and then we get the money on that date, and then we print on this date, and then it'll be in the reader's hands. Like, you have to triple that because four of those things are going to go wrong. Um, so that's definitely something that we've learned. Just build in financial buffer, build in time buffer. And also, I mean, what we used to do, and I don't know if this was exactly a mistake as much as just a privilege that we've gained over time as we've built up a company and a readership and some kind of regular influx of finances from selling books, and not just through Kickstarters, but also through bookstores and through our website and through the book trade. Um, what we used to do is basically come up with the concept of a book, do a cover design and maybe a couple of sample layouts, um, and maybe some printed samples, then do the Kickstarter, and then create the book. So it would take, a year maybe to do all the creative and editorial work, and then another year to do all the production work. So we would have these super long timelines, often which we were way too starry-eyed about how fast we could get things done. Uh, and also, we've really kind of screwed ourselves up on this a couple times. I mean, maybe my favorite project we've done thus far is a project that's not even finished and was supposed to come out, I believe, in 2021. It's this project called Dracula: The Evidence. And it's been a passion project for me since before Beehive was even an idea. I've been thinking about this, and I'm working with this amazing partner who does a lot of design stuff for us, Paul Keppel at Headcase Design. And it's an edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is an epistolary novel for anyone who hasn't read it. It's all in the form of telegrams, letters, newspaper clippings. A part of it is supposed to be a transcription of an audio recording of Dr. Seward's notes. So there's dozens of different kinds of documents, if not hundreds. And so we're making this box set, which comes in a suitcase, and it is all the primary source documents of Dracula. So if something is a letter, it is a handwritten letter in an envelope. Um, and it, we've crowdfunded it in 2019, 2020. Somehow I thought we could do it in a year. It is now 2024. It is not done. It's close to done. It will be done in 2025. I swear, knock on wood. But that's something we really learned. We have a lot of angry customers. It's a very expensive project because I mean, the production is insane. It's so expensive and so time consuming.
I was wondering how you even produce a suitcase. Like,
oh, we have a suitcase manufacturer. We hired a suitcase manufacturer to
that's
make it for us.
unbelievable.
And I think we
Wow.
were their first client saying, can you make it old and dusty? Like, can you really make it look waterlogged and like it's falling apart? Like, what?
Were they able to make that happen?
Yeah, yeah, it looks
Wow.
amazing. I mean, but literally, we're not even done. We've been working on this suitcase we had a sample of it that we used for the Kickstarter we were like, this is pretty close. It's not exactly right yet. but it's still not quite done. We're still
Wow.
sending proofs back and saying we
Mm.
need to change this material. And we have dozens of vendors. We have hundreds of materials. We have all these different, we have like 20 calligraphers working on the project. We cast it.
Wow.
So it's like every character is a different calligrapher.
Huh.
And it's just an insane, all-enveloping project. And we raised a lot of money. We raised almost $500,000 for this project, and thank God, because we're really not making any money on it. We're spending
Mm.
every penny of it in
Mm.
production. Um, but we got a lot of angry customers on our hands who are like, I was told I would get this 3 years ago, and it's not even about to ship. So that's one, this is a very long way of answering a very simple question, but that is one thing that we learned is we have two projects. That's one, and there's another one that were both supposed to come out 3 years ago and are both still in process. So now what we do is we've completely changed our process. Our Kickstarter is at the end of the production process now instead of at the
Mm.
beginning of the production process.
Yeah.
So we wait until a book is totally finished. It's ready to go. We have the files prepared for the printer. We've done all the proofing. We have samples. And the last thing we have to do when the Kickstarter is over is just send it off to the printer. The money from the Kickstarter pays the printer bill. And so it's a much more, we still have huge delays, but they're behind the scenes that we don't have angry customers waiting for the books. Like it's fine. Pinocchio was delayed a year and a half in the pre-Kickstarter phase. We thought it was going to kickstart in like 2022, and it wasn't almost till the end of 2023. But it's no big deal, because you just that time it takes the time it takes, and then it's ready when it's ready. And so that's a huge thing we learned. Like, don't get too starry-eyed about how Mael and I are both bad at that. Like, we've gotten better over the years, but we both are just, I think, to be in this business in the first place, you need a little bit of a delusional enthusiast in you.
It's true.
And I have a lot of delusional enthusiast in me. I mean, I think both of us, we like have too much confidence or something. Like we really believe like things are going to be kind of easy. Like we so excited and we're like, we can do this and we're going to kill it and it's going to go great. And then you're in it and you're like, Jesus Christ, what did I do? Um, but you can't kill that part of yourself because you kind of need it. If you really became a realist, you would probably quit. Uh, so I don't want to lose the fantastical side of my personality, but I'm trying to build processes that will allow me to be delusional and not screw myself too hard.
Yeah, I feel so much kinship with so much of what you're saying, and I feel like we could talk all day, but I do want to be mindful of your time. So I want to kind of bring this plane in for a landing a little bit by asking you about um, an interview which I saw you do, and you mentioned one of the reasons that you and Mael founded Beehive Books in the first place was because you saw the current publishing landscape as broken. And I'm hoping that you can elaborate on that a little further.
Yeah, I mean, I've like worked all over the publishing industry in various ways, mostly in kind of DIY ways, but I've also worked with big companies a few times. I've worked as an author and an editor, and I used to own a bookstore. That's how I got into
Mhm.
publishing. We used to publish books through our bookstore in the pre-Beehive days. Um, so I think I've seen publishing from a lot of angles, and I know a lot of artists and authors. Um, and it seems like such a mess of an industry to me. And so many of the practices in it are either non-functional or just really horribly extractive of creative people, or both, often both. And especially in comics, but also in mainstream publishing. I think it's so hard to make money. I think it's so hard for authors. And I've seen people who really got that brass ring. They got the big Random House book deal with a nice advance, and then it just goes nowhere. The book comes out and it gets good reviews, but there's just like never any money beyond whatever seemed like a good advance at the time. But then the book takes you 3 years to do. Um, and I know a lot of people who are very well-known artists who I think are seen from the outside as like celebrities. Like they're seen as the top of the top of the comics industry. And a lot of them are close friends of mine, and you get to know people and they start talking about their careers, and you're like, oh man, they're like broke. Like they're not making any money, at least off publishing. I mean, I know some artists who make pretty good money selling their original pages and things like that, which is a whole different market. Um, but you're like, they did a best-selling book and they got like $10,000 for it. And it took them like 2 years, and they have millions of readers. Like they have tons of followers online. And so it just all seems like such a mess to me. And it seems like it's only getting harder. Um, and I don't totally understand why, because I think there's a big demand for great books and for great art. And there's a lot of readers out there. There's not as many readers as there should be, and there's not maybe as much demand for books as there should be, but there's a lot of demand. I think people love books still. Um, and so I'm so curious about how things work in various parts of the publishing industry. I got into this with no particular business fascination, but you just start to see how things work and you get curious about how they work. And you start to see how bad things are for so many people. You start to want to find solutions to some of those problems. So, we have a million problems of our own, and we can't pay our employees as much as I would like to pay them. We can't pay our artists as much as I would like to pay them. But considering especially how small we are and how few readers we have when you really boil down to it, I think we've got a couple thousand readers. I mean, over the course of our company, we probably have tens of thousands of people who have bought our books. But in terms of regular customers, it's probably no more than 2,000, probably much less than that. Um, it works a little bit better because we're going direct to our customers. We get a bigger percentage of the money per book sold, which allows us to pay our authors and our contributors and our freelancers maybe a little bit better than a lot of big companies who have, a million times more money than we do. Um, and it's definitely not utopian. There's like a million problems and there's a million things I'm trying to figure out and solve. But it does seem like in some ways a more sustainable model. And if we could ever do the thing that I'm always trying to do and never really succeeding at, which is just get a bit bigger, we could double the size of our readership. I think we would really have something where we really could, pay much better rates to people. Um, and we've had a couple of really big successes where we were able to really pay artists, that we usually have profit share deals or royalty rates. And, there's always that end of the year when you're writing all the royalty checks. And it's always a mixed feeling because you're like, oh God, all the money is disappearing from our bank account. But you're also like, yeah, these are our authors and I get to send them some money. And, it very much varies from project to project. Sometimes it's no money, and sometimes it's a check for $50. But sometimes you write a huge check to somebody because the project crushed it. And you're like, okay, like they don't have to worry about money for the next year because of this check that we get to write. And that's like an amazing thing to be able to do for people who absolutely deserve it and have done this incredible work that tons of people um, appreciate and love and mean something to their lives. Um, so yeah, I became really interested in like the business side of things just out of necessity and out of like, collective, like a feeling of like what's around us doesn't work. Like I think maybe some of these things did work at some point. I think publishing was a pretty healthy industry at some time, but like a lot of other things, we're just in an era when a lot of infrastructures seem to be collapsing. And I think publishing very much was maybe at the forefront of that. I think maybe that started collapsing sooner than a lot of other things did. Um, so I think for all kinds of creative work and all kinds of production, period, like I think it's incumbent on creative people to like invent something new, to like bring the creativity you bring to the actual creative work to the systems that we build around the work. Um, so yeah, that's a lot of what I hope Beehive can be a part of, is trying to innovate new models for doing things. I can't remember who said a phrase that always stuck with me, and I quote it all the time, so I wish I could remember who said it, but it's publishing is an exercise in possibility. Um, and that's how I look at it. I really want it. I want our books to be, I want to create possibilities for artists, both creative and economic and whatever other kind. I want to create things that maybe wouldn't exist if we didn't exist. Um, so there's a long answer to a complicated question, but yeah, I guess that's where it leaves us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's probably as good a place as any to stop. You're preaching to the choir, as I'm a proud self-publisher for 20 years at this point, and it was really interesting for me to hear that quote from you that inspired this question, because I just wanted to get your thoughts about how you're moving forward in this industry you see as broken. I have similar opinions, and what you're doing differently in order to unbreak that system or make a new system. And so that was really, really interesting to hear. So thank you for going into that. But Josh, you've got Carmilla live right now. Is there anything else you want to say to direct people toward this current campaign that you're running?
Oh, just join us on this journey. It's so much fun that we have on our campaigns and working on our books. And we called our company Beehive because we wanted, it's a community. We can't do it alone, you know, like it's our readership is part of the creative force of what we do. Um, and so we're a very reader focused, sort of community forward publisher. So that's part of what I love about crowdfunding. So we just invite everybody to join the party if they want to.
Great. Well, I look forward to getting my copy too. And thank you so much for joining me here on the Ryan Claytor Patreon podcast. So lovely to have a conversation with you today. And I wish you all the best of luck with Carmilla and all the projects moving into the future. So best of
Thank
luck,
you,
Josh.
Ryan. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate it.